She was hours away from saying, "I do," when someone she trusted most walked her to the river and came back alone. By the time the sun reached its peak, the wedding dress had no bride, the guests had no answers, and a quiet town had already accepted a simple explanation: she slipped. But what if that morning wasn't an accident? What if every smile, every kind word, every moment leading up to that day had been building toward something far more deliberate? This is the story of a wedding that turned into an investigation, of a family that hid more than it showed, and of a truth that refused to stay buried. Stay with me, because every detail matters, and the ending will change how you look at trust forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. On a calm spring morning in a quiet American town, Emily Carter woke up earlier than anyone else in the house. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes everything feel important. It was her wedding day, a moment she had spent months preparing for, carefully choosing every detail, from the flowers to the music that would play as she walked down the aisle. Friends would later say she looked unusually peaceful that morning, as if she had already stepped into the future she had always imagined. Emily was known for her warmth, the way she made people feel seen and valued, and her fiancé, Ryan Mitchell, often said that meeting her felt like finding calm in a world that rarely slowed down. By noon, she was supposed to stand before family and friends and begin a new chapter. But the morning had other plans. Emily's life had not always been easy, and those closest to her knew that her strength came from years of learning how to adapt. After losing her mother at a young age, she watched her father try to rebuild their lives, eventually marrying a woman named Linda Hayes. At first, Linda seemed like a stabilizing presence, someone who brought order into a home that had been shaped by grief. Over time, however, small moments began to stand out. Conversations would end abruptly when Emily entered the room. Compliments carried a tone that didn't feel genuine. There was no open conflict, nothing that could easily be pointed to, but there was a quiet distance that never quite disappeared. Emily chose not to confront it. She focused instead on her future, on her career, on Ryan, and on the life she was building beyond the walls of that house. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, everything appeared to fall into place. Invitations had been sent, the venue confirmed, and relatives had begun arriving from out of town. Linda played her role well, helping with arrangements, offering suggestions, and presenting herself as a supportive figure. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a family coming together for a celebration. Yet a few people noticed something they couldn't fully explain. Linda's involvement felt controlled, precise, as though every detail had to pass through her approval. Emily brushed it off whenever it was mentioned. She believed in keeping peace, in choosing happiness over confrontation, and on the surface, there was no reason to believe that anything was wrong. That morning, as the house slowly came to life, Emily decided to step outside for a moment of quiet. There was a river not far from their home, a place she had visited many times before. It was known in the area for its beauty, but also for the dangers that lay beneath the surface. Locals respected it, keeping their distance, especially in the early hours. Emily, however, saw it as a place to think, a place where she could gather herself before important moments. According to later reports, she left the house just after sunrise, wearing a light robe and simple sandals, telling no one exactly where she was going. It was not unusual for her to take short walks, and no one thought to follow. What happened next would become the center of countless questions. Around the same time Emily was believed to have reached the river, Linda was also seen leaving the house. She told a relative she needed fresh air, that the morning felt too quiet to stay indoors. At the time, it sounded harmless, almost ordinary. But as investigators would later piece together the timeline, these small decisions would take on a different meaning. The path to the river was narrow, lined with trees that blocked much of the view from the road. Anyone walking there would be out of sight within seconds. It was a place where two people could meet without being noticed, where conversations could happen without interruption, and where, If something went wrong, there would be no immediate witness. At approximately 7:15 a.m., a sound broke the stillness of the area. A fisherman who had been setting up his equipment nearby later described it as a sharp cry, sudden and brief. He looked up, expecting to see someone calling out, but the trees made it difficult to locate the source. By the time he moved closer to the path, there was nothing. No movement, no voices, just the quiet flow of the river. He waited for a moment, unsure of what he had heard, then returned to his work. It was only later, when news began to spread through the town, that he realized the significance of that moment. Back at the house, concern grew slowly. Emily had not returned, and the preparations for the wedding were beginning to pick up pace. At first, people assumed she was taking her time, perhaps enjoying a final moment alone before the day's events. But as minutes turned into an hour, the mood began to shift. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Friends searched nearby streets, thinking she might have taken a longer walk. Eventually, someone suggested checking the river. It was a suggestion that carried weight, even before any evidence was found. When they arrived, they discovered her sandals near the edge, placed in a way that suggested she had stopped there. The water moved steadily, offering no clues, no sign of what had happened. Authorities were contacted, and the initial response followed a familiar pattern. Accidental falls near that river were not unheard of, and the presence of wildlife added another layer of risk. The early assumption was simple. Emily had lost her footing, slipped into the water, and been taken by the current. It was an explanation that fit the immediate evidence, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the case might end there. The town began to process the tragedy in those terms, shifting from celebration to mourning in a matter of hours. The wedding was canceled, replaced by quiet gatherings and unanswered questions. Yet something about the situation didn't sit right with Ryan. He knew Emily's habits, her awareness of her surroundings, her cautious nature when it came to the river. The idea that she would stand too close to the edge, especially on such an important day, felt inconsistent with everything he knew about her. He began asking questions, retracing her steps, speaking to anyone who might have seen her that morning. It was during these conversations that small inconsistencies began to emerge. Linda's account of her morning seemed vague, lacking the detail that others provided. She maintained that she had gone for a short walk, but insisted she had not gone near the river. At the time, there was no direct evidence to challenge her statement. Days passed and the investigation continued, though quietly. Then the fisherman came forward. He described the sound he had heard, the timing, and the direction it came from. More importantly, he mentioned something else. He believed he had seen movement between the trees, not one figure, but two. He could not provide clear descriptions, but he was certain that someone had been there with Emily. This detail changed the direction of the case. What had been considered an accident now required a closer look. Investigators returned to the scene, examining the area more carefully, searching for anything that might have been overlooked. It was during this second examination that a key piece of evidence was found. A bracelet, partially hidden among the roots near the riverbank, caught the attention of one of the officers. It was simple but distinctive, and when it was shown to the family, it was immediately recognized. It belonged to Linda. When questioned, she claimed she had lost it days earlier, that it had nothing to do with that morning. However, phone records placed her near the river at the same time Emily was believed to have been there. The timeline that once seemed straightforward now raised more questions than answers. As pressure increased, Linda's composure began to shift. Interviews became more intense, focusing on the inconsistencies in her statements. Investigators revisited her interactions with Emily, speaking to friends and relatives who had observed their relationship over the years. Patterns began to form, subtle but consistent. Comments that once seemed insignificant took on new meaning when viewed together. The image of a supportive stepmother started to fade, replaced by something more complicated, something that suggested long-standing tension rather than simple misunderstanding. Eventually, the evidence reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed. Confronted with the timeline, the witness account, and the bracelet, Linda's story began to change. What started as denial shifted into partial admissions, and finally, into a full account of what had happened that morning. She acknowledged meeting Emily at the river, describing a conversation that quickly turned into an argument. Years of unresolved feelings surfaced in that moment, leading to a confrontation that escalated beyond control. In her own words, it was a push, a single action that altered everything. The river, already dangerous, did the rest. The case moved quickly after that. Charges were filed, and the trial brought the details into the public eye. Testimonies painted a picture of a relationship shaped by quiet conflict, of emotions that had been contained for years until they finally surfaced. The courtroom listened as the events of that morning were reconstructed step by step, each piece of evidence reinforcing the same conclusion. When the verdict was delivered, it confirmed what many had come to believe. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act with irreversible consequences. For those who knew Emily, the outcome brought a sense of closure but not relief. The questions that remained were not about what happened, but why it had gone unnoticed for so long. How could something so serious exist beneath the surface without being addressed? How many small moments had been dismissed? How many signs overlooked? These are the questions that continue to follow this story, long after the case was closed. And now, as you reflect on everything you've heard, consider this. Would you have seen the signs if you were there? Or would it have looked like every other ordinary day, right up until it was too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden, it's simply ignored until it can no longer be denied.